Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carolyn McVean. I'm nearly said the university librarian. I think that might be my next venture. I'm the Parliamentary librarian, and welcome and thank you for being here. Firstly, on behalf of the Parliament of Victoria and its members, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today. We pay our respects to them, their culture, their elders past and present, and we also pay our respects for people from First Nations communities who may be joining us today. I welcome you to our seminar about Victoria's waterways, looking at governance in an era of population growth and climate change. We're pleased to present this event jointly with ATSE, the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, and it's very happy and coincidental that it is Science Week this week. Our moderator today is Dr Jane Doolan, OAM, who is a fellow of the ATSE and coordinator of our joint Library ATSE seminar program. Jan has over 30 years' experience in executive and governance roles, and they're in the pharmaceutical, life sciences, animal health and biotechnology areas. We will get to questions later. There's a couple of microphones around, so save your questions, and before you start to speak, we'll give you a microphone to speak into so we can get your questions. I'll hand you over now to Jan.
Carolyn, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate this third Science and Technology Seminar for 2025, and as Carolyn said, it's on the topic of governing Victoria's waterways in an era of population growth and climate change. Why is this such an important discussion for us to have, you might be asking? I was surprised to learn that Victoria has a natural system of rivers that stretch for over 85,000 kilometres, and we have over 60,000 wetlands. Central to our landscape, these waterways are indeed at the heart of Victoria's livability. Victorian farmers, they depend on water from our waterways as a critical resource, as do all Victorians, whether they live in the city or in a country town, each and every time that they turn a water tap on. All levels of government are involved in a very complex system and multiple systems to govern and protect Victoria's waterways. And yet the very systems, they're under pressure from multiple issues, including our growing population, climate change, and evolving community expectations. Together, these challenges are driving the need for further innovation and governance reform. We might be asking ourselves now, what is the state of Victoria's waterways and what is the current governance framework? And indeed, can Victoria respond to the current and future challenges that it's facing? Today's presenters will share their policy, research and implementation expertise to address these questions and more. I'm now going to introduce both of our speakers so I don't interrupt the flow of their presentations later. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr Jane Doolan. Jane has over 30 years' experience in sustainable water resource management, providing policy advice at senior levels at both the Australian and state government levels on issues such as water supply and security, national water reform, river health, environmental water allocation, catchment management, and the management of water during drought and climate change. She's currently a member of the Darling Basin Authority, a director of Southern Rural Water Corporation, and a founding member of the Water Policy Group. Previously, Jane was the Environment Commissioner with the Australian Productivity Commission, Commissioner with the National Water Commission, Professorial Fellow in Natural Resource Governance at the University of Canberra, and Deputy Secretary for Water in the Victorian Department of Environment and Primary Industries. In 2024, Jane was appointed an honorary member of the International Water Resources Association. I'm also delighted to introduce our second speaker today, Professor Chris Chesterfield. Chris is a professor of practice at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, where he leads industry engagement and research related to water governance and integrated urban and water planning. He is nationally recognised for his leadership and contribution to advancing waterways and urban management, water management and planning practice. Through his role as chair of several ministerial advisory committees, Chris has influenced significant planning and legislative reforms. Of particular note is the Yarra River Protection Willip Jin Burrarong Moron Act of 2017, which designates the Yarra River as a living entity and established the Birrarung Council, a bicultural statutory body to act as the voice of the river. Currently a non-executive director of Barwon Water, Chris's previous roles include General Manager at Melbourne Water, CEO of the Office of Living Victoria, and Commissioner and Chair of the Victorian Environmental Water Holder. In 2022, Chris received the Paul Jerome Award from the Victorian Planning and Environmental Law Association in recognition of his many contributions to the sustainable development of cities over the last 2 decades. After the short presentations from Jane and from Chris, we will have time, I promise, for questions and answers. I'd like to now hand over to our panel. Thank you, Jane.
Yep, no worries. So what I'm going to do is take you through Victoria's waterways at the state level, the framework. Chris is then going to come in and talk about the issues and the challenges from the position of the Yarra. So you'll get the sort of deeper dive within the Yarra catchment as a bit of an example. So, as Jan mentioned, Victoria has something like 85,000 kilometres of rivers and streams, 24,000 natural wetlands of high value, and that is, we've actually drained 25% of our wetlands since European settlement, so we've still got 25,000 high value, and about 120 estuaries. Now, they are fundamental to Victoria. They really are. They're beautiful environments, or they can be. They can be beautiful environments. And they do support a range of critical habitats for flora and fauna. We have something like 54 native fish species, 40 native crayfish species, 38 native frogs, and more than 100 native waterbird species, all dependent on rivers, wetlands and estuaries in Victoria. So critical habitat, critical environment, but critical to the economy, critical to society. So here, those rivers and streams in particular provide drinking water quality for over 5 million people. That can be 10% of the water extracted from rivers and streams on an average year, but can be 20% in a drought year. And importantly, they are the source of irrigation water. And irrigation provides about $5 billion a year into the Victorian economy. And its water usage, about 70% of the water extracted from our rivers and streams is used in irrigation. Less in a drought year, but on average about that. So, economy, environment, but community. Community well-being. So, it's really important for fishing. And we have more than 1 million recreational fishers in Victoria, and they generate $2.3 billion a year, again, for the economy. And whenever you look, you'll see people recreating along a waterway. And it became incredibly important, and I think top of people's mind in COVID, when green space became so well appreciated within our urban environments. To the point that a recent survey showed that at least 70% of people visit a waterway at least monthly, 82% of them personally care about waterway health, and about 3/4 feel personally responsible to do the right thing by waterways. And if any of you are associated with some of the rivers under which there's some controversy, like Anglesey, for example, you'll know that your local communities get really involved. And they're critical, really critical and fundamental to our traditional owners. For them, it is the lifeblood of their country, and they cannot separate and shouldn't separate rivers from country. So, it's critical. They're all critical. Environment, social, economy, Victoria's well-being has a lot to do with the state and their use and their value for their waterways. But the fact that we multiply use them for all of these different things can have impacts, and it's had impacts since European settlement. So effectively, here is a catchment. And if you look at what we do to catchments, we use them, we live in them, we grow things in them. So in a catchment, we might build a dam for drinking water supply. We'll clear catchments for agriculture and for farming, and that will change the hydrology and the runoff and the water quality. We'll clear floodplains and actually build urban developments on them, and that will disconnect floodplains. So in general, our use of living in the place has changed in many cases, the flow regimes of our rivers, the water quality itself, the riparian vegetation on the side, which can act as buffers. It's meant there's bed and bank erosion. We've changed fish passage. I always have a problem with fish passage. Fish can't move up and down and migrate. And we've, in many cases, disconnected our floodplains. And some of this is historical. The gold rush caused untold damage because they actually moved rivers and dug them up. But these pressures are still ongoing. And as a result, we find that our rivers and streams in Victoria, we've got about 21% in good or excellent condition, about a third in poor or very poor. We've got wetlands, as I said, we've drained 25%, but those remaining, about half, are in good or excellent condition. Our estuaries, about a third are good and excellent, about a third poor or very poor. And we also see some of that in the actual status of communities. Our fish communities are generally fairly poor, and a lot of that's to do with carp, but not only. And our water birds, their populations boom and bust depending on the year, but the trajectory tends to be down. And as I said, it's not just historical legacy, although a lot of it is. The pressures of development, of constant use, of using water, extracting water, of maintaining those catchments, they're ongoing. So managing our waterways to actually meet our needs, it's a balancing act. There's trade-offs all over the place. So how do we do it? What are we aiming for? Well, one of the things I need to impress on you is we are not aiming to return these rivers back to a pristine state. A, it's not possible, and B, they continue to support our economy and our community. So what we are aiming for depends on what sort of river it is. If it's in pretty good condition, and these generally tend to be in national parks and reserves, of course the aim will be to keep it that way. But the vast majority are what we would call working rivers. Think the Yarra that Chris will talk about, think the Goulburn, think most of those rivers draining into the Gippsland Lakes. They're working rivers, we use them. They provide water for irrigation, for drinking water, for town supply. They have agriculture in their catchments. They need to continue those jobs, but we can actually have them in a better condition and ensure that they can be sustainably providing those values to the community and giving a bit extra if we manage them appropriately. And then we've got a group that we would call highly modified. Moonee Ponds Creek, we've channellised, we've drained, there's a range of things. For these, again, they have to keep providing those values, but there is some opportunity in some cases where it's cost effective to change the nature of them and become a little more, if you like, environmental in terms of the other benefits they can offer. So how do we do this in Victoria? Before I get to that, a key message that will continue to come up. They are community assets, they're assets, and they need to be thought of that way. They need ongoing management, particularly those that I called the working rivers. It's not just get them to a condition and let them go. That won't happen. They actually need to be managed with a constant effort if we want to maintain those values that we are deriving from them now. So how we do it, and Victoria has got a leading waterway management framework. They've had it for over 30 years. I suppose I should declare. We have a waterway strategy. The first one was in 2002 and I was part of that team. That was introduced under the Bracks government. But the second waterway strategy was sponsored by the Napthine government. So most of the directions that we'll talk about here have had bipartisan support over 30 years. So the waterway strategy sets up the policy framework for how we manage them. And a key thing that they set up is regional waterway programs. There's 10 of these around the state, 9 in the regions and 1 for the Port Phillip and Western Port area. And these strategies are where those objectives for river management are actually developed, where priorities are set and where targets are set. They're developed every 10 years. They're developed with community input and by CMAs. And under those strategies, a whole lot of things happen. Firstly, your on-ground works programs that many of you may be familiar with. Fencing, revegetation, pest, plant and animal control, putting fishways in, catchment programs for water quality, floodplain works, bed and bank stabilisation works. Many of you will have seen some of that happening. The other thing that they actually set the priorities for is environmental water. Now, every river in the state has some passing flows in it. Absolutely every river that's required. But on top of that, mostly they're insufficient, but on top of it, what we have is 2 water holders in Victoria who hold entitlements that can be deployed with flexible use. We've got the Victorian Environmental Water Holder who holds 667 gigalitres of water, and in the north, in the Murray-Darling Basin's part of Victoria, we have the Commonwealth who holds 750 gigalitres. And how that water gets deployed is actually set through the environmental watering plans and actions under the regional strategies. And the last bit they do is a bit of regulation, development controls, works on waterways, works on floodplains. All of this is done, the regional part of it, by catchment management authorities. They do it in partnership with their communities, with their local stakeholders and local governments and traditional owners. In Melbourne, it's done by Melbourne Water, and Chris will talk about that. And it's funded through the environmental contribution of water price that was introduced in about 2004. That's 5% in urban communities and 2% in the rural authorities. And through that environmental contribution, about $50 million a year has gone into these programs: regional waterway plans, on-ground working programs, environmental watering. Now, as a result of that, we see change. We do see change, but it's long term. Just an example of the Genoa River over in the I don't know, that side. that side of the thing, east of the state. In 1989, it was incredibly poor condition, no bank habitat, very few fish, very vulnerable to floods. But with work in bed and bank stabilisation, fencing and revegetation in 2009, you've got bass coming back into it. You've got a river that is now relatively resilient. The same with environmental watering. This is environmental watering up in the Mallee during the Millennium Drought with environmental water. Areas of the floodplain considered to be dead, coming back to life. And here is 20 years on some pretty important sites: Barmamilluwa, Gunbower Forest, Hatter Lakes. 20 years ago, the red indicated not meeting any environmental objectives, but with environmental watering through works and use of water moving in 20 years towards green, sustainable improvements. And it's not just those things that CMAs do as well, it's involving their community and making sure their communities are part of this. And this is just an example. Bendigo Creek Water Watch Group, they provide every year a river health snapshot just of their creek. So, we've got a robust framework. It's been going for 30 years. Of course it needs change and evolution. And we look to the future, the challenges that it has to meet is climate change. And for Victoria, the likely future is one of drying, with more severe, more frequent droughts and more severe flooding. It's also one of population growth. And as that growth happens, mostly it will be in Melbourne and regional urban areas. There's a much greater demand for green space and amenity. And finally, meeting the needs of traditional owners. Those traditional owners have been left out of water management in the past, and they want entitlements and water rights for economic development of their communities and far more influence in water management itself. So, the future: less water, more people, those people with greater demands and more uncertainty about extreme events. So with that, I will leave you with my key message, but also Chris to take you through some of that, but in particular in relationship to the Yarra.
Great, thanks, Jane. Well, thanks for coming along to listen to a couple of old waterway managers. Jane and I started working together 40 years ago, Jane. Before that framework existed. There's been so much hard work and incremental change over time, but much of it grew out of the Public Bodies Review Committee work from 1984, which was very much a bipartisan approach. So as Jane said, I want to bring you back down, I guess, to looking more at, I guess, this region with a particular emphasis on the Yarra River Birrarung. This is a region that I've worked in with Melbourne Water for more than 20 years. Melbourne Water is the Waterway Drainage and Floodplain Manager and the Catchment Management Authority for this region. That only all came together in about 2008, so the history has been MMBW became the Drainage Manager in 1927. Dandenong Valley Authority was created in 1964 to look after the Dandenong part of that catchment. Here, Dandenong Valley Authority functions were extended to become the Dandenong Valley and Western Port Authority in 1989, particularly to deal with the growth in the southeast, extending into what's now Casey, but also to deal with a massive erosion that had been set off by all of the drainage works in the what's Kooyrup Flood Protection District, that set off massive erosion cycles that then destroyed a whole lot of the seagrass in Western Port Bay, which is now recovering significantly because of that work in the catchment. Then finally, the DVA, Dandenong Valley Western Port Authority, was merged with the MMBW in 1991 to create Melbourne Water. And then in 2004, Our Water, Our Future water policy recommended that Melbourne Water's operating area be extended into the top of the Maribyrnong and the Werribee catchment, where again, huge amounts of Melbourne's growth is occurring. So within this catchment, a lot of the functions of the waterway manager are to do with servicing growth and making sure that growth can occur safely. Melbourne is probably the most flood-prone capital city in Australia. It doesn't get in the news all that often, although the Maribyrnong has been recently, because we've had good governance arrangements in place to look after those things. But all the Kooyrup swamps, the Karam swamps, Elwood, Elstonwick, so much of Melbourne is actually built on swampland. And so much of the Port Phillip Western Port catchment is urbanised, and just in the Yarra catchment alone, 2.5 million people live in that Yarra catchment. We tend to think of, I guess, the region and our waterways and the Yarra from this point in time, generally. I mean, it's interesting. This is called The Founding of Melbourne, and there's a great book out there on the bookshelves that's got this painting in that book about the artists and writers of the Birrarung. But what attracted people, of course, to this region was the resources. And if we, think back of what was here before Europeans came, I think a lot of the Lower Yarra might have been like the Coorong in South Australia. The river was constantly shifting. There were swamplands and wetlands. There would have been abundant bird life, and that picture on the left it's actually a picture of the Western Treatment Plant, which is where probably a lot of the bird life that you used to find on the Lower Yarra has now gone. And interestingly, a lot of the water that sustains that bird life in the Western Treatment Plant is water that's extracted from the Yarra, used by all of us, and then flushed down the toilet to Werribee. But this is the attraction, I guess, that brought Europeans to this place, the richness and the resources, people seeking prosperity. But we changed that place. Melbourne is the busiest container port in Australia, but this is how we arrived, I guess. Part of the role of the Yarra is as Australia's major port. Jane mentioned the gold rushes. A lot of my ancestors came to this country in the 1860s in the height of the gold rushes. The Yarra was one of the first places in Australia where gold was discovered, and some of you might know of the Pound Bend Tunnel in Warrandyte, where they diverted the Yarra across a bend and then drained the bend and then mined the alluvial gold in it. These things were devastating to the river. Agriculture, the need to settle the floodplains, draining the floodplains, undertaking river improvement to make those floodplains more usable. The Yarra Valley is one of the richest agricultural areas in the country, and water sustains agriculture right across the Port Phillip region. This is what river improvement used to be. This is what river managers used to do. So all of the Yarra River has had those snags pulled out of it. This is essential habitat for fish and other creatures in rivers. And of course, urban environment requires river improvement as well. And there's some scenes of river improvement. You might recognise Herring Island in the background there, Como Oval and the Burnley Cut. Again, cutting through the bends, shortening the rivers to improve the conveyance and reduce the flood flows. These parts of the Yarra River are probably 3 times wider than they were naturally. There's 16 kilometres of bluestone lining along the Yarra River as well. This is what river improvement was. Providing drainage and stormwater services to the city. So this is like an X-ray picture of Melbourne. You can see the CBD in the bottom left-hand corner there, the Yarra River. This is all the drainage system. Where does it all go? Straight into the river, having a devastating impact in terms of water quality and hydrological change in the river. But it's not all bleak. What drew us to this place was the resources, the rich resources, particularly associated with water and the region. And of course, Melbourne still draws most of its drinking water from the Yarra River. One of a tiny handful of cities in the world, less than 4 cities in the world, have a natural, healthy water supply drawn from closed catchments. It's 160 hectares of catchment reserved in the headwaters here, but also in the Thomson catchment for Melbourne's water supply. We had a vision early on, back to the 1929 Metropolitan Plan for Melbourne, for our waterways to become an important part of the open space network. And this is part of what waterway managers have done. That plan has largely been realised. If you look at a map of Melbourne now, so much of Melbourne's open space is along its waterways. Melbourne is a waterway city and the Yarra River is the principal waterway. There's 3,500 hectares of open space along the Yarra River, which has been incrementally pulled together over decades. And if you look at the visitation across Melbourne's waterways, there's more than 50 million visits every year. About 39% of those come to the Yarra River, but particularly in the west now, they're becoming increasingly important as that's becoming the focus of Melbourne's population growth. And just a quick video that I took down at Dights Falls. There's no sound coming through. This has got really good soundtrack. But this is just a reflection of a weekend of how popular some of our waterways like Dights Falls are. How much do people like waterways? What do they think about the management of waterways? Well, we've been monitoring people's satisfaction with waterways since the early 1990s. They were at a low of 54% satisfaction at one point. We're now hitting 90, 92%. That's because of the sorts of work that has been done by organisations like Melbourne Water, but also working with local government, providing access to waterways, continuous access along waterways, building the trail network, improving the vegetation, working on water quality. Here's an example of the water quality change over the last few decades. This is E. coli, which is an indication of faecal contamination, sewage contamination. There's orders of magnitude improvements. This is getting close to swimmable levels now. So, and again, internationally, the Yarra River compares very favourably. This is a result of the investment in backlog sewering program through the 1970s. There were 270,000 unsewered properties in Melbourne in the early 1970s. Most of that's now been eliminated. So it's probably a bit hard to see this, but this is out of Melbourne Water's water plan or pricing submission, which highlights the sorts of work that it's been doing over a 5-year period. And you can see some of the numbers down here, $185 million to be spent over a 5-year period on vegetation management, plantings and so on along waterways. 8,800 kilometres of vegetation being maintained, 880 kilometres of vegetation plantings over that 5-year period. There is this constant investment going on. There are now 490 stormwater treatment wetlands that have been constructed since about 2000 in Melbourne. So every urban development in Melbourne now is serviced by, I'm talking about greenfield growth, that's telling me something, is has stormwater treatment wetlands. So Melbourne has led the world in what we call water-sensitive urban design. So this is now treating stormwater, doing things like infiltrating stormwater and reusing stormwater. So this environmental flows that Jane talked about are part of this. So Melbourne Water does the planning and the management of those environmental flow releases. The environmental water holder holds the entitlement, but Melbourne Water, as the Catchment Management and Waterway Management Authority, does all of the planning and the management of those releases. And I guess there's other things that we've done as well, as we've really come to love our waterways, and the way Melbourne, the city of Melbourne, has changed over time is a reflection of that. So South Bank has changed from an industrial area to this. It started with the Arts Centre. Some might not remember the Gas and Fuel Corporation. There's a few young faces in the room. But this is what's now been replaced by Federation Square, a place of celebration and of connection with the river. So there has been a huge amount of effort to address all of those issues of the past and to now start to respect our waterways and help people to connect with them and get use and enjoyment from them in different ways, while also preserving the economic benefit, for irrigated agriculture and so on. But we still have those long-term challenges of population growth, climate change, and Water is Life is the state policy document now for Aboriginal access to water. So this is about addressing issues of Indigenous water justice. So just quickly, I guess in terms of a drying climate, we've already experienced for the Yarra, for example, a 20% decline in long-term flows, even greater in some of our other waterways in this region, like the Werribee. Barwon, the Moorabool, has been one of the waterways most severely affected, and of course the southwest of Victoria is in drought at the moment. I'm a director of Barwon Water. Geelong's water supply is down to 36% at the moment, and there's work going on to duplicate the Melbourne to Geelong pipeline now. So this is an increasing problem. Our waterways provide most of the water for drinking water and irrigation. That's going to come under increasing pressure. Population growth. So much of our growth is pushing out to the west and the northwest at the moment. There's an example of the Western Truganina in 2000 and 2017. It is just packed with houses. What is the open space? You can see Skeleton Creek and then a drain that's also now been turned into a creek and a series of wetlands. This is the principal open space across Melbourne, and particularly in the west. And this is all incorporating stormwater treatment wetlands. So all the water that's draining from these new urban areas now is going through treatment systems before it goes into the waterways. So you don't have big Paran main drains pouring litter into our waterways in these new growth areas. But we've still got to do work on existing parts of Melbourne. This is the arc of change, I guess, in this waterway and urban stormwater management. I was brought up in the heartbreak suburbs that were developed in the 1950s and the 1960s. No made roads, no footpaths, no sewerage system. Moonee Ponds Creek, I guess the catchment was developed without any thought for drainage and stormwater management and the environment. We concrete lined it. We built the Tullamarine Freeway next to it. Waterways have been spaces to put stuff. Monash Freeway, Tullamarine Freeway, electricity transmission lines. They've been regarded as just a space for stuff, not a place that has, in a sense, deserving of something better and something important for people. So we started to recognise the importance of those waterways and develop them for open space. We've started to, with our urban growth and development now, reserve areas along waterways, do stormwater treatment, now doing water-sensitive urban design. This is a stockland development out at Mernda. This is actually doing aquifer storage and recovery of the stormwater, which is represented by this diagram about integrated water management. So we've progressed the technologies and the practices to do much better. Even in places like docklands. This stuff's 20 years old now. Stormwater treatment wetlands in docklands. Stormwater treatment and harvesting to irrigate the open space in docklands. Street tree pits. This is Royal Park, harvesting water, converting a footy oval to take stormwater from the Royal Park main drain, treat it, store it in a 35 megalitre storage and then use it to irrigate open space. This is all about getting the multiple benefits, protecting waterways but providing community amenity and biodiversity and all those things. So with that growth, where urban stormwater runoff is increasing, we have to do these things if we're going to protect the waterways and Port Phillip Bay in the longer term. And then just to take us around that full arc, Jane really highlighted how our framework for looking after waterways is nation leading. The other place where we are nation leading now is recognising Indigenous water justice and addressing. So the water sector's pretty much. I'm finishing. Yep. The water sector's pretty much ignored First Nations people for 30 years. I've been 40 years in the sector, and it's only in the last 10 years that I've really started engaging with traditional owners. And they're seeking a greater role in managing country, and they're seeking a greater role in having a voice in governance. And this is part of the innovation of this Parliament in bringing about the Yarra River Protection Act, Willip Jin Birrarung Marron, which is the first Victorian legislation to be co-titled in Indigenous language. It was the first time in the history of this Parliament that traditional owners appeared in Parliament as part of the legislative process, and the legislation itself reflects Indigenous ways of knowing, so thinking of the river as a living entity, and establishes a Birrarung Council as a bicultural statutory entity to act as the voice for the Yarra River. So it does a few things. So this is bringing the arc about. Europeans came here, pretty much dispossessed traditional owners and have exploited those landscapes, but we've started to reconcile ourselves with those landscapes. Now we're reconciling ourselves also with traditional owners. Thank you.
So I'm glad I didn't make a pinky promise about the time for Q&A, because we have only got a couple of minutes. I'm very conscious of your afternoon activities, but the floor is open if there are questions. John.
Just a quick one. You sort of touched on this, but have you looked at the plan for Victoria activity centres around metropolitan Melbourne, but beyond that into the regions as well, and the impacts on water in light of the debate that we've been having in here over some time now, which is whether catchment management authorities and the other water authorities have the bandwidth to invest in the water infrastructure that's going to be needed to support the emergence of whole new communities. I know we don't have a lot of time, but just your headline thoughts on that.
Fantastic question. So I think there is a real issue about the ability to invest in the infrastructure to provide the services for that growth, particularly in redeveloping areas, because it's easy to think that all of that infrastructure exists, including the natural infrastructure in terms of open space, waterways and so on. There's constant pressure on the water institutions, the water authorities, to be able to build the hard infrastructure to service growth as well. And I think that it is important to ask the question around how do the existing governance settings around water pricing and so on enable those water businesses to keep up with that investment. So that's been a real issue for Sydney Water recently. It's been in the news in Sydney Water. Sydney Water didn't get the pricing outcome that they were after, and there's been a lot of discussion up there now about their ability to keep up with that growth and development.
I think it's a really good question, because one of the things that Chris has been talking about is integrated water cycle management. And when you come to new developments and green space, they are decisions to be made that are then there forever. You either miss the opportunity or you have embedded it. And frankly, that's one of the weaknesses of the framework. Who owns the green space, who manages the green space, and who makes those decisions? And I think what we're trying, I suppose, to say is there are minimum standards like the stormwater, so yes, you'll get that. But will you get the full gamut of what you could have under the current situation is something that needs further debate.
Did you have something to add?
Yes, I just a further question to that. So hi, Anne-Marie, I represent the southeastern metro area, where of course there's been a number of housing developments that have moved out and water has, as you know, been turned into lakes, etc. Two questions to do with, leading on from where John left off. In terms of development and further developments in the future, and particularly say Greater Dandenong, City of Casey and Frankston, is there a lot of dialogue, or could there be more dialogue between some of the government departments in terms of planning? Because we don't tend to build according to our landscape. So rather than trying to redirect the water and the landscape to actually find ways that we could be a bit more innovative in our housing area, because obviously I live out towards Berwick, and I can say that when we had the floods out there in certain areas when it was built on a wetland, it was catastrophic for the people that lived there. They didn't know, only locals knew not to buy in that area. Everybody else that came in didn't. So they had to cope with those floods right through their homes, and the houses were not built according to what they could have been. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of dialogue between people who understand the waterways and planning departments and ministers. That's the first question. I just wondered whether how much has been improved in that area, whether there's still space for improvement. The second part is to do with contamination of water. We have a number of underground waterway springs from Berwick and all the way across, Limbrook and beyond. What is being done to, I guess, advocate and manage the potential for a number of contamination situations that seem to appear in some of these housing areas, and what would you recommend or suggest and how we go about addressing this?
Got Jane looking at each other now. I don't know whether there's time to cover all of those issues and whether we would have all of the knowledge and the experience to give you really good answers to those questions right now. There is, I think, organisations like the VPA, which doesn't exist anymore, had a really important role in creating the collaborations necessary between agencies to do the appropriate planning. Melbourne Water's always done that, but with a particular perspective based on its functions. And I think that's one of the difficulties, that all organisations come to that space with their functions in mind and also trying to protect themselves from taking on too much, which might be taking on too many, local government being one, not wanting to necessarily accept assets that bring with them a long-term maintenance and operational cost. I think it is a really difficult space, the way we do plan long-term development. Jane talked about integrated water management, and that's really one of the things I think that's challenging us at the moment, is to get all of the outcomes from that urban growth. And there's so much pressure at the moment on housing affordability, reducing red tape. That's going to make it even harder potentially to have those sort of collaborations and to potentially get those outcomes. We might find ourselves taking more shortcuts.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As I said, there's a good minimum standard there, but there are some decisions to be made. So in planning these suburbs, you can plan them with maximum green space, with all of those bells and whistles. And you can work the arrangements out. But they are initially more expensive. So that will feed in, possibly not too much, but it can feed into house prices. Over the long term, those things come back. There's no doubt, and work shows that. But it's a longer term thing. So there's some of, I think, the policy decisions that governments have, been wrestling with for years, but continue to have to wrestle with those as we have this massive growth spurt. On the contamination question, can't answer that, sorry. Happy to talk about it, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you all very much for your attendance here this afternoon, and I'd like you to join with me in thanking Jane and Chris for their detailed presentations and for the questions and things that have come from the floor. Very much appreciated. I'm able to tell you that you can continue your conversations with both of them into the future. The library would be very pleased to support the connections, and Jane and Chris are very willing to speak with you at your earliest opportunity. So this is just the beginning of that conversation, and I think if we've ever heard about a topic that requires whole of government participation, this is it. Thank you all very much.